One Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields, and as they made their way, his disciples began to pluck heads of grain. The Pharisees said to him, "Look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" And he said to them, "Have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need of food? He entered the house of God when Abiathar was high priest, and ate the bread of presence, which is not lawful for any but the priests to eat, and he gave some to his companions." And he said to them, "The Sabbath was made for humankind, and not humankind for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath." Again, he entered the synagogue, and a man was there who had a withered hand. They watched him to see whether he would cure him on the Sabbath, so that they might accuse him. And he said to the man who had the withered hand, "Come forward." Then he said to them, "Is it lawful to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath, to save life or to kill?" But they were silent. He looked around at them with anger. He was grieved at their hardness of heart, and said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He stretched it out, and his hand was restored. The Pharisees went out and immediately conspired with the Herodians against him, how to destroy him. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Christ.
Last Sunday, I spent much of the day walking. After our pilgrims came back to the United States, I stayed in Scotland for a time of vacation. So last weekend, I was in Aberfeldy, Scotland, a small town very close to where my ancestors are from, in a place that has become very dear to me in the last 16 years. This was my fourth visit to Aberfeldy during those 16 years, so by this point, this small town in Scotland has become pretty familiar to me. I know many of the hiking trails around, the best restaurants, my favorite shops, and nearby attractions. It's a place that has both marked time for me at significant points in my life and remained timeless, with many of its buildings, roads, and rugged beauty not having changed in hundreds of years. As I walked last Sunday, first by the river and then later down the road leading from the town to my family's ancestral castle, I pondered how my ancestors fished in this same river, crossed the same ancient stone bridge, took pride in the same castle, and walked through the same valleys, gazing at the same hills and mountains. I've been working on some genealogical research, and so I know that my sixth great-grandfather left this area in 1750, when he was 30 years old and newly married, to sail to Charleston, South Carolina. As I walked, I wondered at his younger life, at his decision to leave all that he knew and cross the sea. I wondered if he ever came back to visit. And then I marveled at how I and many of my family members have made the reverse trip across the sea, intentionally returning to our place of our Scottish roots. As I read the passage in 1 Samuel this morning, oddly enough, I just kept going back to last Sunday, to thinking about my walking around Scotland. It took me some time, but I finally realized that the parallel that I was feeling had to do with the repetition of God's call to Samuel and the fact that this call comes when Samuel is but a boy, and it takes time to mature. One of the things that I reflected on as I walked the road from Aberfeldy to the castle was how many times I had walked that road before, and when. The first time was in 2003. I was 20 years old, and it was the summer after my sophomore year of college. A friend and I decided to take a 2-week trip to Europe, going to Paris, London, and Scotland. It was the first trip abroad for either one of us. I had grown up seeing pictures of my ancestral castle and hearing stories from a handful of relatives who had visited, including my grandparents. But going for myself was a huge dream come true. My friend and I only spent 1 day in Aberfeldy on that trip, but it was the most significant day of the trip for me. I returned again 3 years later, this time with my parents and my sister. It was the first trip to the castle for each of them, and getting to be there with my family was a wonderful experience. We stayed in Aberfeldy for 3 days that time. By this point, I had finished college and had just completed my first year in seminary at Candler School of Theology. I didn't quite know where life was taking me or where Jesus was calling me, but I felt confident that I was on the right track and working towards my MDiv. I was also fairly confident that ordination was not in the picture. Haha. It was 8 years before I returned for a third time, in 2013. During those 8 years, I had completed my MDiv at Candler, joined the Episcopal Church, worked for 3 years, moved to Boston and gotten another graduate degree, and moved to Nashville, Tennessee. I came to Aberfeldy this time to escape. I was struggling with a broken heart, broken dreams, and a whole lot of questions about who I was and what I was meant to be doing with my life. I decided to take a break and get as far away from everything as possible for a week. And when I questioned where I wanted to go, I felt this small town in Scotland and my ancestors' castle beckoning me. I stayed for a week in a B&B and really got to know the area that time. It was my first time traveling abroad alone, and it became one of the most empowering experiences of my life. Being there gave me a deep sense of rootedness in the past and in who I am, but also a deep sense of self-confidence that I had recently been lacking. I returned to Nashville without answers, but with a strong sense that I could face whatever lay ahead, and an even stronger sense that God was with me through it all, even when I didn't recognize that. It was only about 4 or 5 months after that trip that I first began feeling my call to ordination. Another 5 years passed before I made it back this time. During those years, I had answered my call to ordination, done yet another graduate degree, been ordained, worked my first 2 years in a parish, and had just finished leading my first pilgrimage. My life is dramatically different now than it was the last time that I was in Aberfeldy. And this time around, I was filled with a deep sense of gratitude. Gratitude first and foremost for God for helping me to become who I am and for calling me into this vocation. And gratitude for the opportunity to be here at St. Mary's, where not only do I get to worship with you and work with you and care for you week after week, but I also have the opportunity to do incredible things like lead a pilgrimage to places that have been on my own bucket list for years. No one ever told me that pilgrimages would get to be a part of my life as a priest, but I am so grateful that they are. As I walked and prayed and reflected on all of this last Sunday, I marveled at the way that God works in our lives, calling us over and over again, meeting us where we are in that moment, and leading us forward. Samuel was but a boy when God first spoke to him, and he didn't even recognize that it was God's voice. But God was persistent, calling over and over again, just as God is with us. And once Samuel did realize it was God speaking to him, his prophetic career was launched, even though it took many years to come to fruition. Sometimes returning to a place that has marked significant points in our lives, or even spending time with a good friend who we may not see very often, can help give us perspective on how much things change as the years go by, and how much God is a part of all of that. My final walk to the castle on Sunday night, I cried the whole way there. I cried tears of joy and of deep gratitude. I cried because I know that the next time I return, my life will be very different yet again. I cried out of thanksgiving for all that God has done thus far, and all that I cannot yet see, but fully trust that God will do in the years to come. May we all stay attentive to God's voice in our own lives, and when we hear it, may we respond as Samuel does. Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening.